The station called Aetherspire hung in the cold silence of space like a cathedral built by gods who had long since stopped praying. And it rotated slowly around a neutron star whose pale blue light painted every corridor in the color of old ice. It was the largest diplomatic structure in the known galaxy, home to embassies and trade halls and council chambers, where species that had mastered faster-than-light travel thousands of years before humanity learned to use fire came to argue about borders and resources and power. Corporal Eric Vasquez of the Terran Union Security Detachment stood in Corridor 7G, on Deck 14, arms behind his back, feet shoulder-width apart, eyes forward, and he had been standing like this for the last 4 hours without complaint, because that was what humans did on the Aetherspire. They stood in hallways and tried not to be noticed. He was 29 years old, broad-shouldered and square-jawed, with dark eyes that carried the kind of calm you only find in people who have made peace with being ignored. His uniform was standard Terran gray, clean but undecorated, and if any of the tall, luminous aliens walking past him even registered his presence, they gave no sign of it. A pair of Vielethi diplomats glided past him, and their bioluminescent skin cast soft golden light across the walls, and they spoke in a language that sounded like someone singing underwater. They did not look at him. They never looked at him. Humanity had been part of the galactic community for about 50 years now, which in the timescale of species that lived for millennia was roughly equivalent to a baby crawling into a boardroom meeting. The elder races tolerated humans the way a university professor might tolerate a dog that wandered into the lecture hall, with mild amusement and a quiet hope that it would not make a mess. Humans were classified as a Class 7 endurance species in the Galactic Registry. Sounded impressive, until you learned that the scale went up to Class 1, and that Class 7 was only 2 steps above pre-sapient wildlife. What the classification failed to capture, what no database or xenobiology report could fully explain, was the strange and stubborn fire that burned inside every human being. A fire that had nothing to do with technology or psionic ability, and everything to do with something far older and far more dangerous. But nobody on the Aetherspire knew that yet. Eric shifted his weight from one foot to the other and listened to the sounds of the station around him. The hum of the gravity generators, the distant chime of a transport pod arriving, the clicking footsteps of a Draken trade envoy marching past with its armored tail swinging behind it like a weapon. His earpiece crackled, and Danny's voice came through, low and dry as always. "You still alive out there, Vasquez?" "Barely," he replied. "Anything exciting happening?" "In 7G. A cleaning drone bumped into my boot about an hour ago. That was the highlight." Danny laughed, and the sound was warm and human, and out of place in the cold alien architecture. Specialist Danny Okafor was the closest thing Eric had to a friend on the station, a sharp-eyed woman from Lagos, who had joined the Terran Security Corps because, as she put it, she wanted to see the stars, and the recruiter had left out the part about standing in hallways for 12 hours at a time. "Heads up," she said, her tone shifting. "The Vielethi royal delegation just docked at Bay 9, full ceremonial escort, about 40 guards, and apparently the third princess herself is aboard." Eric raised an eyebrow, even though nobody was around to see it. "Which one is the third princess?" "Saravith Kael'thira. They call her the Ice of the Dominion, and from what I have read, she has earned that name 10 times over." "Sounds fun." Redistribution Accords Summit, and she brought her daughter with her, which apparently has the whole Vielethi court in an uproar, because the kid is considered, and I am quoting their cultural files here, unfit for public presentation. Eric felt something tighten in his chest, just slightly, the way it always did when someone talked about a child being called unfit for anything. "How old is the kid?" "Equivalent to about 5 in human years. Her name is Liralel." He said nothing, but he filed the name away in the back of his mind without knowing why. An hour later, the Velithi procession passed through his section of the station, and Eric saw them for the first time. A column of impossibly tall beings with skin that glowed like liquid moonlight, draped in robes that seemed to be woven from light itself, moving with a grace that made every other species look clumsy by comparison. At the front walked Princess Saravith Kael'thira. Immediately why they called her the Ice of the Dominion. She was beautiful, the way a glacier is beautiful, vast and cold and completely indifferent to whether you survived the encounter. Her eyes were pale silver, and they swept across the corridor without pausing on anything, as if the entire station and everyone in it existed several levels beneath her notice. Her guards flanked her in perfect formation, their armor catching the light in patterns that shifted like living things, and behind them walked attendants and advisors and protocol officers in an order that probably had deep cultural significance that Eric would never understand. And then, at the very back of the procession, trailing just a few steps behind the last attendant, there was a small figure. Lyral was tiny by Velithi standards, barely reaching the waist of the adults around her, and where their skin blazed with golden bioluminescence, hers flickered unevenly, like a candle struggling against it. The wind. She had wide violet eyes that darted everywhere, at the walls, at the ceiling, at the strange alien architecture, with the kind of open wonder that only very young children possess before the universe teaches them to stop being amazed. One of the royal guards glanced back at her and hissed something sharp in Velithi, and the little girl flinched and hurried to catch up, her small feet pattering on the polished floor. Eric watched her go, and he felt that tightness in his chest again, stronger this time. Later that evening, he sat in the human mess hall, which was a small windowless room on Deck 19 that the station administrators had generously labeled Terran Cultural Space, despite the fact that it contained nothing cultural except a coffee machine that occasionally worked and a poster of Earth that someone had taped to the wall with adhesive strips. Danny sat across from him, eating something that the station food synthesizers insisted was chicken, but that tasted more like the idea of chicken described by someone who had never actually eaten any. A new recruit named Torres had joined their unit that week, fresh from the Terran Academy, and he was still wide-eyed enough to ask questions that the older soldiers had stopped asking years ago. "Why do they treat us like this?" Torres asked, gesturing vaguely at everything around them. "We are a spacefaring species. We have colonies. We have warships. We cracked faster than light travel on our own. Why do they act like we are nothing?" Danny looked at him with the patient expression of someone who had explained this many times before. "Because to them we are nothing. Not yet, anyway," she said. "The Velithi have been building empires for 600,000 years, and the Draken have been waging wars for even longer, and the Selassie have been a collective consciousness since before our sun was born. We showed up 50 years ago with duct tape on our starships and enthusiasm in our hearts, and they are still trying to figure out if we are worth paying attention to." "That is not fair," Torres said. "No," Eric agreed quietly, "but fair is a human word, and out here nobody speaks our language." The mess hall fell silent for a moment, and in that silence Eric thought about a little girl with flickering skin and violet eyes who trailed behind a procession of giants. And he thought about how unfair the galaxy was to anyone it considered small. His earpiece buzzed, and a priority alert scrolled across his wrist display. Intelligence had intercepted coded communications, suggesting that an unknown faction aboard the station was planning to disrupt the Redistribution Accords Summit by force. Eric read the alert twice and then looked at Danny, who had received the same message. "Our orders?" he asked. "Same as always," she said, and her voice carried no bitterness, only the flat acceptance of someone who understood exactly where humans stood in the hierarchy of things. "Stay out of the way." The summit began on the third day, after the Vielethi delegation arrived, and the Aether Spire hummed with a tension that Eric could feel in his teeth, like the vibration before a thunderstorm. Every species on the station seemed to sharpen overnight. Conversations grew quieter, glances grew longer, and the guards from every delegation walked with their hands a little closer to their weapons than they had the day before. The redistribution accords were the biggest political event in a generation, a once-in-a-century negotiation that would determine which species gained the right to colonize newly discovered star systems in the outer reach. And the stakes were high enough that even species who normally avoided conflict had sent warships to orbit just beyond the station's sensor range. 3 factions dominated the proceedings. The Vielethi Dominion, led by Princess Saravith, sought to expand their holdings through the elegance of political maneuvering and ancient treaty rights. The Draken Combine, led by Warlord Kazrith, wanted the same territories and had no patience for elegance. They were a militant reptilian species with armored hides, and a cultural tradition that considered diplomacy to be what you did while your fleet was still warming up its weapons. And the Selassie Collective, a hive mind species that thought with 1,000 brains at once, sought to acquire colony rights not through force or politics, but through a cold mathematical argument that their species could make the most efficient use of the resources. Eric's unit received new orders that morning. Due to a gap in the security rotation, his squad was temporarily reassigned to patrol the corridors near the Vielethi Royal Wing. "Just stand there and be invisible," Sergeant Holt told them during the briefing, a man whose face looked like it had been carved from tired stone. "Do not speak to any member of the Vielethi delegation. Do not make eye contact unless addressed. And for the love of everything holy, do not touch anything that glows." Eric took his position in a corridor adjacent to the royal suite, a hallway lined with crystalline panels that projected slowly shifting patterns of Vielethi art, and he stood with his arms behind his back, and his face carefully blank, and he became furniture again. For 2 hours, nothing happened. Then he heard small footsteps. Lyrel appeared at the end of the corridor, alone, her violet eyes wide with the particular excitement of a child who had successfully escaped her caretakers. She was wearing a simple gown that shimmered faintly with her uneven bioluminescence, and she moved with the careful, deliberate steps of someone exploring a place they were not supposed to be. She spotted Eric and froze. He looked at her, she looked at him. Neither of them moved for several seconds, and then Lyrel tilted her head to one side with an expression of pure curiosity that transcended every boundary of species and culture and language. It was the universal face of a child encountering something new. She walked toward him slowly, her bare feet silent on the polished floor, and stopped about 3 feet away. "You are very small for a guard," she said in accented Galactic Common, and her voice sounded like tiny bells. Eric almost smiled. He was 6'2" and 220 pounds, but compared to the 7-foot Vielethi warriors who guarded her mother, he supposed she had a point. "And you are very far from your room," he replied quietly. She considered this and then reached out and poked his arm with one luminous finger. Her eyes went wide. "You are so warm," she exclaimed, and the surprise in her voice was so genuine that Eric could not help but let the corner of his mouth twitch upward. She poked him again, then pressed her whole palm flat against his forearm, and she made a sound that was something between a gasp and a giggle. "Your skin is like stone, but warm. How do you do that?" "Humans just run hot," he said. "We cannot help it." She grabbed his hand with both of hers and turned it over, examining it with the intense focus of a tiny scientist conducting critical research. "Your fingers are so thick," she observed, "and you have lines on your palm. What are they for?" "Nobody really knows," Eric admitted. She looked up at him and smiled, and her flickering bioluminescence steadied for just a moment, glowing brighter and warmer, and the sound she made was a laugh that rang through the corridor like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Then the temperature in the hallway dropped by 10 degrees. Eric felt it before he heard it. The presence of someone whose authority was so absolute that even the air seemed to stand at attention. Princess Saravith Kael'thara stood at the far end of the corridor, and her silver eyes burned with a cold fury that could have frozen starlight. "Lyral," she said, and her voice was perfectly controlled in the way that volcanoes are perfectly still in the moment before they erupt. The little girl released Eric's hand and took a step back, her glow dimming. Saravith crossed the distance between them in long, fluid strides that somehow conveyed both grace and the promise of violence. And she placed herself between Eric and her daughter like a wall made of ice and ancient rage. She looked at Eric, and the contempt in her gaze was so complete, so layered with centuries of superiority and the primal terror of a mother who had found her child with a stranger, that Eric felt it like a physical force pressing against his chest. "You are not fit to breathe near her," Saravith said, and every word was a blade wrapped in silk. Eric held her gaze for 1 second, not in defiance, but in acknowledgement, and then he inclined his head respectfully and stepped. "My apologies, Your Highness," he said, and his voice carried no anger and no shame, only a calm steadiness that somehow made Saravith pause for the briefest fraction of a moment before she turned away. She took Lyral's hand and led her down the corridor without looking back, and the little girl glanced over her shoulder one last time at the strange, warm creature who had let her examine his hands without pulling away. Then they were gone, and Eric stood alone in the corridor, with the shifting Valithi art casting patterns of light across his gray uniform. Later in the mess hall, Danny asked him what had happened. She had heard through the security channel that a Valithi royal had reported an incident. "A mom found me near her kid," Eric said simply, "and she told me I was not fit to breathe near her daughter." Danny winced. That must have stung. Eric shook his head and took a sip of the terrible coffee. "She does not know me." All she saw was a stranger, standing next to the most important person in her life, and she reacted the way any good mother would react. He set the cup down and stared at nothing for a moment. "I would have done the same thing." That night the intelligence reports grew worse. Coded transmissions between the Draken delegation and unknown contacts suggested that Warlord Kazreth was planning something during the summit. Not an assassination exactly, but something violent enough to destabilize the negotiations and make the Valithi appear weak before the other factions. Eric's unit was briefed and told in clear terms that whatever was coming was not their problem. Human security personnel were to maintain perimeter positions and defer to the primary defense forces of the major delegations. "We are not here to play hero," Sergeant Holt said. "We are here to watch and report and stay alive." Eric nodded along with the rest of his squad, but later, the lights in his quarters dimmed, and the station settled into its artificial night cycle. He lay on his bunk and stared at the ceiling, and thought about a little girl who had called his skin warm and his fingers thick. He thought about how she glowed unevenly, like something beautiful that the universe had not quite finished making. And he thought about the intelligence reports, and the way the Draken guards moved through the station corridors, with a hunger in their eyes that he recognized from his years on Earth. It was the look of predators who were done pretending to be patient. Eric closed his eyes and told himself that it was not his problem. He almost believed it. The grand atrium of the Aether Spire was the most beautiful room Eric had ever seen, and he had the terrible feeling that he was about to watch something very ugly happen inside it. The ceiling arched 300 feet overhead, a dome of living crystal that refracted the light of the neutron star outside into a cascade of pale blue and silver that made the entire space look like the inside of a frozen dream. Thousands of diplomats filled the hall, representatives from dozens of species, each delegation dressed in the ceremonial finest of their civilization. The Velithi in their robes of woven light, the Draken in their polished battle armor that they insisted was formal wear, the Selassie in their collective formation that moved like a single organism wearing 100 bodies. It was the Summit Gala, the ceremonial opening of the redistribution accords, and every faction had gathered in one room to smile at each other while silently calculating how to take what they wanted. Eric stood on the outer perimeter with his squad, positioned near a service entrance about 60 feet from the main floor, close enough to see everything, but far enough away that nobody would notice a handful of humans in gray uniforms. "Beautiful, is it not?" Danny murmured beside him. "Beautiful and wrong," Eric replied, his eyes scanning the room in the automatic pattern that years of training had burned into his reflexes. Something is off tonight. He could feel it. A wrongness in the rhythm of the room, like a song where one instrument was playing just slightly out of key. The Draken delegation was too relaxed. Warlord Kazrith stood at the center of his group, with a smile on his scaled face that showed too many teeth, and his warriors kept shifting their positions in a pattern that looked random but was not. Eric had seen that kind of positioning before. It was the way you arranged people when you wanted to control sightlines. Create confusion quickly. Princess Serevith stood across the hall with her entourage, her silver eyes moving across the room with the careful attention of someone who knew she was surrounded by enemies, but was too proud to show fear. And beside her, small and bright and completely unaware of the danger coiling in the air, stood Lirael. The little girl was dressed in ceremonial Vielethi clothing that made her look like a doll made of starlight, and she held her mother's hand and looked around the enormous room with the overwhelmed expression of a child at an event that was far too large and far too loud for her. Eric watched her, and something in his chest tightened into a knot. "Vasquez," Danny whispered, "your jaw is doing that thing." "What thing?" "The thing it does when you are about to do something stupid." He unclenched his jaw and said nothing. The gala proceeded through its opening rituals, speeches from the station administrators, formal greetings between delegation leaders, the careful choreography of interstellar politics, and then Warlord Kazrat stepped forward and requested permission for a cultural demonstration, as a gesture of Draken goodwill. Eric's hand drifted toward his sidearm without conscious thought. 6 Draken warriors moved into the center of the atrium, carrying resonance lances, long polearm weapons that hummed with kinetic energy and were traditionally used in Draken combat rituals. The demonstration began, and the warriors spun and clashed their weapons in a display of martial skill that was genuinely impressive, their armored bodies moving with a power and precision that made the floor vibrate with each impact. But Eric was not watching the display. He was watching the angles. The warriors were drifting, slowly, naturally, in a way that looked like part of the choreography, toward the Velithi delegation. He was watching how each spin and each spin clash moved the formation 3 feet closer to where Serevith and Lirael stood. He was watching Kazrith, who stood at the edge of the demonstration with his arms crossed and his too wide smile fixed in place, and his eyes locked on the Velithi princess with an intensity that had nothing to do with cultural appreciation. And he was watching Lirael, who had let go of her mother's hand and taken 2 small steps forward because the spinning weapons made pretty lights, and she was 5 years old, and the world was still full of things worth moving toward. "Danny," Eric said, and his voice had changed. It was flat now, empty of everything except a clarity that came from somewhere deeper than thought. "I see it," she whispered back. "The lance on the far right. The warrior holding it has been adjusting his grip for the last 30 seconds, and his weapon is cycling to full charge. Eric, we are on the perimeter. We are 60 feet away. Orders are to stay here." "I know." The demonstration reached its crescendo, and the warriors raised their lances, and the crowd leaned back. And then everything happened in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The warrior on the far right lost control of his weapon, and the resonance lance discharged a full concussive blast directly at the spot where a tiny girl with flickering skin stood 2 steps away from her mother's protection. The blast was a wave of compressed kinetic force, designed to stagger creatures with exoskeletons and dense musculature, and it crossed the distance at a speed that gave the Velithi guards exactly enough time to realize what was happening, but not enough time to do anything about it. Seravith saw it, and she screamed, a raw, terrible sound that shattered her mask of composure like glass. The sound of a mother watching death reach for her child. Nobody moved fast enough. Nobody except Eric. He did not calculate the distance, or the odds, or the consequences. Something inside him, something older than reason and deeper than training, something written into the marrow of his bones by 100,000 years of human evolution, grabbed control of his body and hurled it forward. He covered 60 feet in a time that should not have been possible for a human being, his legs driving him across the polished floor with an explosive force that made several aliens physically recoil, and he reached Lirael 1/2 second before the blast did. He scooped her up with one arm and twisted his body around her like a shell closing around a pearl, and he pulled her against his chest and curled himself over her so that every part of her was shielded by every part of him. The resonance blast hit him square in the back. The impact was like being struck by a charging vehicle. Eric felt his ribs crack, 3 of them snapping like dry branches, and he felt his left shoulder blade fracture along a line that sent white-hot lightning through his entire nervous system, and he felt blood vessels rupture across his back in a pattern of internal damage that would have killed most species in the galaxy outright. The force of the blast sent him skidding across the floor, his boots scraping against crystal, his body spinning from the momentum, and through all of it, through the shattering of his bones and the tearing of his flesh and the roaring darkness that tried to swallow his consciousness whole, he did not let go of the child. He did not let go. His back hit a pillar, and he stopped, slumped against it, blood already soaking through his gray uniform in a spreading stain of deep red, and every breath was a war between his lungs and his broken ribs that his lungs were slowly losing. But Lirael was pressed against his chest, crying and shaking and terrified, but whole and unharmed and alive. A haze of pain, so intense that the edges of his vision had turned black, and he managed something that was almost a smile. "You are okay, kid," he whispered, and his voice was barely there, just air shaped into words by sheer stubbornness. "You are okay." The atrium was silent. 1,000 aliens stood frozen in a silence so complete that Eric could hear his own blood dripping onto the crystal floor, and every single one of them was staring at the human who had just done something that none of them could explain. Seravith reached them first. She dropped to her knees on the floor in front of everyone, a princess of the Velithi Dominion kneeling in front of 1,000 diplomats and dignitaries and enemies, her composure destroyed, her silver eyes wide, with a terror that was transforming in real time into something else, something fierce and trembling and too large to name. She took Lirael from Eric's arms, and the little girl clung to her mother and sobbed. Seravith held her daughter so tightly that her own bioluminescence flared to a brightness that hurt to look at. Then she looked at Eric. He was broken and bleeding and barely conscious, slumped against a pillar in a ruined uniform soaked with his own blood. And he looked back at her with dark eyes that held no expectation of gratitude or reward or recognition, only a quiet satisfaction that the child was safe. Seravith opened her mouth to speak, and nothing came out. For the first time in her life, Princess Seravith Keltira, the ice of the Dominion, had no words. Eric's eyes fluttered closed, and his head dropped forward, and the darkness finally took him. and the last thing he felt before consciousness left was the warmth of the little girl's tears soaking through his shirt. Medical teams rushed in, and chaos erupted. The Draken delegation claimed the discharge was an accident, while Kazreth spread his hands in a gesture of false surprise, and security forces from every faction converged on the scene with weapons drawn and voices raised. But in the middle of all of it, Saravith knelt on the floor, holding her daughter, and staring at the unconscious human who had broken his own body to save a child that was not his, from a species that was not his, in a conflict that was not his. And the security footage was already spreading through the station's networks, because 1,000 personal recording devices had captured every second, the impossible sprint, the desperate grab, the impact, the slide, and the moment when a bleeding human whispered to a crying alien girl that she was okay. Within the hour, every species on the Aether Spire had seen it. Within the day, the entire sector would see it. A Class 7 nobody, a Terran corporal, who was supposed to stand in hallways and be invisible, had thrown himself into a blast that should have killed him to save a child he had met once in a corridor. Duty, not for politics, not for glory. He just moved. And the galaxy, for the first time in 50 years, looked at humanity and did not see furniture. Eric Vasquez woke up in pain, which was how he knew he was still alive. The medical bay was bright and cold, and smelled like ozone and something faintly sweet that he could not identify. And when he tried to move, his back erupted in a symphony of agony that made him gasp and clench his fists against the sheets. "Easy," said a voice he recognized, and Danny's face appeared above him. Her dark eyes tight with worry, she was trying very hard to disguise as professional concern. "You have been out for almost 2 days. How bad?" he managed. 3 broken ribs, fractured scapula, ruptured blood vessels across most of your back, and enough internal bruising that the Valithi doctors actually used the word impossible 3 separate times. Impossible good or impossible bad? Impossible as in they cannot believe you are not dead. Apparently any Valithi who took that blast would have died on impact. And the Draken medical staff said even one of their warriors in full armor would have been critically wounded. Eric closed his eyes and let out a long, slow breath that hurt in ways he did not know breathing could hurt. "The kid," he said, "Lyrael is completely unharmed, not a scratch." Something in his chest loosened, something that had nothing to do with his broken ribs, and he exhaled again and felt the first moment of genuine peace since the blast had hit him. "Good," he said quietly. "That is good." The next several days passed in a blur of medication and sleep and the slow grinding work of healing. And Eric learned through Danny and the rest of his squad what had happened after he lost consciousness. The political fallout was enormous. The Draken Combine was facing condemnation from nearly every faction on the station. Kazreth continued to insist the Lance discharge was an accident, but the security footage told a different story, and 3 neutral delegations had formally filed protests with the Station Council. The Valithi delegation had gone from being one faction among several to being the object of intense sympathy and political support, because the sight of their princess kneeling on the floor, cradling her child, while a human bled beside her, had struck something deep in species that most people assumed had no capacity for emotion. And Eric himself had become the most talked-about person on the station, which was the last thing he wanted. "You are famous," Taurus told him during a visit, his young face bright with a pride that Eric found exhausting. "The footage is everywhere. They are calling you the Terran Shield on the networks." "Please tell me you are making that up." "I am absolutely not making that up. You are a hero, Vasquez." Eric stared at the ceiling and wished very much that he could go back to standing in corridors and being invisible. On the 4th day after the incident, something happened that the medical staff would talk about for years. Eric was dozing in his bed when the door to his room opened with a sound so quiet that it should not have woken him. But his instincts registered the change in air pressure and the faint scent of something luminous and ancient, and his eyes snapped open. Princess Saravith stood in the doorway. She was alone. No guards, no attendants, no protocol officers, and that single fact was so unprecedented that Eric's pain-fogged brain needed several seconds to process it. A Valithi princess did not go anywhere alone, ever, and certainly not to the medical quarters of a human security corporal on the lower decks. She stepped inside, and the door closed behind her, and she stood at the foot of his bed in silence, her silver eyes moving across his face and his bandaged torso and the medical readouts that displayed his vital signs in blinking lights. She stood there for a very long time, because even through the haze of medication, he could see that she was fighting something inside herself. Some wall of pride and protocol, and 10,000 years of cultural certainty that told her she should not be here. That a princess of the Dominion did not visit the bedside of a broken human. That what he had done was merely the function of a primitive species operating on instinct, and deserved acknowledgement, but not this. Not her presence, not her silence, not the way her hands trembled slightly at her sides. But she was here anyway. "You held her," Saravith said finally, and her voice was stripped of its usual cold authority, leaving behind something raw and unsteady that Eric suspected no one in the galaxy had heard from her before. "Even after the impact, even as your bones broke and your blood spilled, you did not let go of her." "No," Eric said simply. "Why?" He thought about giving her a formal answer, something about duty or training or the protocols of the Terran Security Corps, but he was tired and broken, and the medication had dissolved whatever filter normally stood between his thoughts and his mouth. "Because she was scared," he said, "and she was small, and that is all I needed to know." Saravith stared at him, and something shifted in her expression, a crack in the glacier, a fracture in the ice that revealed something underneath that was not cold at all. She turned and left without another word, and the door closed behind her with a whisper. The next morning, Danny told him that the Valithi had invoked something called the Kael'tharvin, the life debt. "It is the most sacred bond in their entire civilization," Danny explained, reading from a cultural database on her datapad, her eyes getting wider with each line. "When someone saves the life of a member of the royal bloodline, the debt cannot be repaid with wealth or titles or territory. The debtor must offer the highest thing they possess, welcome." What does that mean for a princess? Danny looked up from the datapad, and her expression was a complicated mixture of awe and alarm. "It means she has bound her house to your fate, Eric. Publicly, formally, in front of her entire delegation, she declared the Kael'tharvin in the main council chamber this morning." Eric sat up too quickly, and his ribs punished him for it with a jolt of pain that made white spots dance across his vision. "She did what?" "Her advisors apparently tried to stop her. Binding a royal house to a human is unprecedented. It has literally never happened in the entire history of the Dominion, but she would not be moved." "I was doing my job," Eric said, though even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were not entirely true. "That is exactly what she said you would say," Danny replied. And then she said, and I am quoting the official transcript here, "He was not doing his duty. His duty placed him on the perimeter 60 feet away. He chose to be where he was, and I will not allow him to diminish what he did by calling it obligation." Eric leaned back against his pillow and stared at the ceiling and tried to process the fact that a 2,000-year-old alien princess had just permanently bound her royal house to a human corporal from Texas because he tackled her kid out of the way of an energy blast. "The Terran Union Diplomatic Corps is losing their minds," Danny added helpfully. "They have been trying to figure out what Kael'tharvin means in terms of human legal frameworks for the last 6 hours, and apparently the answer is that it does not translate to anything we have. Eric closed his eyes. This is insane. You jumped 60 feet into a concussive blast to save an alien child. Insane left the building a while ago, my friend. That afternoon, Lirael came to visit him. She arrived with a single Vilethi nurse who looked deeply uncomfortable about the entire situation. And the moment she saw Eric, she broke away and ran to his bedside with the unstoppable momentum of a small child who has decided where she wants to be. "Ericy," she exclaimed, and the name she had invented for him rang through the medical bay like a bell. She climbed onto his bed before anyone could stop her, her small luminous body scrambling up the sheets with a determination that suggested extensive practice at climbing things she was not supposed to climb. And she settled against his side with a sigh of contentment that vibrated through his broken ribs like music played on a cracked instrument. It hurt. It hurt enormously. Eric did not move a single muscle, because the child was warm against his side, and her flickering bioluminescence had steadied into a gentle glow, and she was already falling asleep with her small hand curled around his finger. And he would have endured 100 more resonance blasts before he disturbed that peace. The Vilethi nurse made a strangled sound of distress and moved to retrieve the princess. But a voice from the doorway stopped her cold. "Leave them." Seravith stood in the entrance, and this time her silver eyes were not looking at Eric with contempt or calculation or even gratitude. She was looking at the image of her daughter, her fragile, flickering, unfit daughter, sleeping peacefully against the side of the man who had broken himself to keep her whole. And in the doorway where the light from the medical bay met the shadow of the corridor, the ice of the Dominion felt something she had not felt since before the court began whispering about her child's flaws, since before her own mother suggested sending Lirael away, since before the weight of a dynasty had frozen every soft thing inside her into armor. She felt safe. "He stays with me," Seravith said to the nurse, and her voice carried the weight of a decision that had already been made somewhere deep inside her, somewhere that titles and politics and the opinions of ancient civilizations could not reach. The human stays. The weeks that followed Eric's reassignment to the Vilethi royal household were among the strangest of his life. And considering that his life had recently included sprinting 60 feet into a weapons discharge, and waking up as the most politically significant human in the galaxy, that was saying something. His new quarters were in the Vilethi wing of the Aether Spire, and they were approximately 40 times the size of the bunk he had shared with 3 other soldiers on Deck 19. The room was all curves and soft light, with walls that pulsed gently with bioluminescent patterns, and furniture that seemed to have been grown rather than built. And the bed was so comfortable that the first time Eric lay down on it, he actually laughed out loud, because the contrast with his old military cot was so absurd it crossed the line from unfair into genuinely funny. They gave him Vilethi clothing, flowing garments of a material that felt like water and light had been woven together, and he wore them because refusing a gift in Vilethi culture was apparently equivalent to a declaration of war. But he looked at himself in the reflective wall panel and felt like a bear that someone had dressed in a silk robe. "You look ridiculous," Danny told him over their private communication channel, and he could hear her laughing even through the audio distortion. "I am aware. The collar is especially good. It makes you look like a very confused priest." "Thank you, Danny. Your support means the galaxy to me." His days took on a new rhythm, strange and disorienting, but not unpleasant. As a Kael'thar-bound ward of Princess Seravith's house, he existed in a category that Vilethi society had no precedent for. Not a servant, not a guard, not a diplomat, not a guest, but something that occupied its own space in their rigid social hierarchy. A space that had been empty for so long that nobody quite remembered the protocols. Meant that everyone made it up as they went along, and the results were sometimes awkward and sometimes absurd, and occasionally unexpectedly wonderful. Saravith kept her distance at first. Their interactions were formal and brief. She would acknowledge his presence with a nod when they passed in the corridors of her wing, and occasionally she would relay instructions through an attendant regarding his schedule or his access permissions, and she spoke to him directly only when necessary, her words precise and measured, and carrying the careful neutrality of someone who was still deciding what to feel. Eric did not push. He understood, in the instinctive way that some humans understand people, even when those people are not human at all, that Saravith was processing something enormous, that the Kael'thar was not just a political act for her, but a crack in the foundation of everything she believed about the universe, and that she needed time to rebuild around the fracture. So he was patient, and he was present, and he was himself, and slowly the walls began to come down. The first crack came when Saravith discovered that Eric read poetry. She had entered a common room in the royal wing to find him sitting by a viewport, reading from a datapad, and her curiosity overcame her reserve, enough to ask what he was studying. Terran literature, he said. Poetry, mostly. There is a human poet named Mary Oliver who wrote about paying attention to the world, and I find her work useful when things get complicated. Saravith's expression shifted into something he had not seen before, genuine surprise, followed by a flicker of what might have been indignation. Humanity has poetry? We have a lot of poetry. And the galaxy does not know this? The galaxy has not asked. She took his datapad without permission, which he later learned was actually a sign of respect in Vilethi culture, acknowledgement that someone possessed something worth taking, and she read in silence for 20 minutes, her silver eyes moving across the translated text with an intensity that made the air around her shimmer. When she handed it back, her expression had changed again, and this time the crack was wider. "This is beautiful," she said, and the admission clearly cost her something. "Your species has been among us for 50 years, and you have been carrying this, and nobody thought to look." "We are easy to overlook," Eric said, without bitterness. She studied him for a long moment, and he could see the machinery of her ancient mind working behind her silver eyes, recalculating, adjusting, making room for a possibility she had never considered. That the small, quiet species she had dismissed might contain depths that her 2,000 years of life had not prepared her to recognize. The second crack came when Eric discovered Saravith's garden, lost in the Vilethi wing. The corridors all looked the same to him, an endless maze of glowing walls and curved archways. And he had opened a door, expecting to find a storage room, and instead found himself standing at the edge of a small enclosed garden filled with bioluminescent flowers. They were extraordinary, hundreds of blooms in colors that human eyes were barely equipped to perceive, pulsing with a soft light that responded to the air currents in the room, creating patterns of illumination that shifted like breathing. And in the center of the garden, kneeling in the soil, with her hands dirty and her ceremonial robes hiked up around her knees, was the third princess of the Vilethi dominion. She looked up at him, and for one frozen moment they stared at each other, and Eric saw something in her expression that he recognized with absolute clarity: embarrassment. The specific embarrassment of someone who has been caught being soft in a world that requires them to be hard. "This is for Lyrael," she said quickly, almost defensively. The flowers respond to bioluminescence. When she walks among them, they synchronize with her light patterns, and it makes her feel it helps with her condition. Eric looked at the garden and at the princess kneeling in the dirt, and at the careful attention that had been given to every bloom and every arrangement, and he understood that this was not a medical treatment, This was a mother building a world where her daughter's flickering light was not a flaw, but a symphony. "It is beautiful," he said, and he meant it with every broken rib and every scar on his back. Serevith looked at him, and the defensiveness melted away, and for a moment she was not a princess or a political figure, or the ice of the Dominion. She was a mother who loved her child, and who had finally met someone who saw that love without judgment. "You may visit whenever you wish," she said quietly. She was not just talking about the garden. The arguments started the following week, and they were magnificent. Serevith could not let go of the question that had haunted her since the moment Eric threw himself in front of her daughter. Why? "It was instinct," Eric said for the 10th time, sitting in the garden while Lirel chased a bioluminescent butterfly nearby. "Instinct does not cross 60 feet in 2 seconds, Serevith countered, her voice carrying the precise frustration of someone who has run the calculations and found them wanting. "Instinct does not override the survival drive that every species in the galaxy shares. Instinct does not make a creature sacrifice itself for another creature's child. Human instinct does. That is not an explanation. That is a tautology. It is the truth. I saw a child in danger, and my body moved before my brain could stop it. And even if my brain had been faster, I do not think it would have stopped." Serevith stared at him with an expression caught between frustration and something that looked dangerously like admiration. "Your species is insane," she said. "We prefer the term committed." "Committed to what?" "To each other, and apparently to small glowing children who poke our arms in corridors." Lirael ran over at that moment and climbed into Eric's lap without preamble, and he shifted to accommodate her with the automatic ease of someone who had already learned the particular geometry of holding a Veilithi child. And she leaned against his chest and announced that the butterfly had refused to be her friend. "Give it time," Eric said seriously. "Butterflies are cautious." "Like mother?" Eric glanced at Serevith, whose silver eyes had gone very wide. "Yes," he said, "exactly like your mother." That night, long after Lirael had been put to bed, Eric found Serevith sitting alone in her garden, in the dark. Flowers had dimmed to a faint pulse, and the princess sat among them like a statue carved from moonlight. And she looked more tired than he had ever seen her. Not the physical exhaustion of a body pushed too far, but the cosmic weariness of someone who had been carrying a weight for so long that she had forgotten what it felt like to set it down. Eric sat beside her without asking permission, because he had learned that Serevith respected directness more than deference, and they sat together in the dark among the dimly pulsing flowers, while the neutron star turned slowly outside the station walls. "My people live for 2,000 years, Serevith said, and her voice was quiet, almost fragile, stripped of every layer of armor she wore in public, until what remained was just a woman speaking to someone she trusted. In all that time, not one of them has ever done what you did, not for a stranger, not for another species, not without calculation or obligation or the expectation of return." She turned to look at him, and her silver eyes held a question that was larger than words. "Why, Eric? Truly why?" He was quiet for a long time, not because he did not know the answer, but because he wanted to give it the weight it deserved. "Because 2,000 years is long enough to learn caution," he said finally. "Humans do not live that long. We do not have time to hesitate." The words hung in the air between them, simple and true, and Serevith looked at him with an expression he had never seen on her face before. Not pride, not gratitude, not the cold calculation that her species had perfected over millennia of political survival. It was wonder, pure, unguarded, devastating wonder, the expression of an ancient being encountering something genuinely new for the first time in centuries. She did not look away, and he did not look away, and in the garden the flowers pulsed softly in the dark. Other side of the wall, a little girl with flickering light slept peacefully in her bed, and the galaxy spun on in its vast uncaring way, unaware that something very small and very important had changed. The next morning, Lyral found Eric in the corridor outside his quarters, and grabbed his hand with both of hers, and pulled him toward the observation deck with the irresistible force of a child on a mission. "Come see, Ericy, the star is doing the blue thing again." He let himself be dragged, wincing at the pull on his still healing ribs, but not slowing down, because the child was excited, and her light was glowing steady and warm. And there were some forces in the universe that no amount of pain could make him resist. Saravith followed behind them at a distance, watching, and when a Valethi advisor approached her with a datapad full of scheduling questions, and asked how long the human would remain with her household, she did not look at him. Lift Lyrael up, so the little girl could press her face against the viewport and gasp at the neutron star blazing in the void, its pale blue light washing over both of them, the human with the scarred back, and the child with the flickering glow. And the image burned itself into her memory with a permanence that would outlast empires. "He stays," she said, and it was not a command, and it was not a debt, and it was not the obligation of the Kael'tharvine speaking through her. It was a choice, free and deliberate, and terrifying in its simplicity. "He stays." The advisor hesitated, sensing that something had shifted in a way that his training had not prepared him for, and he opened his mouth to ask a clarifying question. But Saravith was already walking forward, toward the observation deck, toward the human and the child bathed in starlight, and her steps were lighter than they had been in years. Behind her, the advisor closed his mouth and watched her go, and he did not understand what he was seeing. But the flowers in the garden had begun to glow brighter that morning, even without Lyrael present, as if the light inside them had found a new reason to shine. The galaxy had always measured worth in power, in lifespan, in the elegance of a civilization's achievements. But in the silence, after a concussive blast, in the arms of a bleeding human who would not let go of a child that was not his own, the galaxy had learned that it had been measuring the wrong things entirely. And somewhere in a xenopolitical research institute on the far side of the sector, a Selassie analyst finished a report and gave it a title that would be debated for decades to come. On the Irrational Altruism of Homo Sapiens, a Threat Assessment. The report's conclusion was a single sentence that the entire collective had voted on unanimously. Do not give them a reason to protect each other, because you will not survive what follows. S.P.